Chapter 6, Part 1, we're going to look at cost behavior and high volume analysis. Cost behavior. What we're talking about is costs that change as volume changes. There are three common cost behaviors. We have variable costs, we have fixed costs, and then we have what we call mixed costs, which is the total of variable plus fixed costs. Now, key characteristics of variable and fixed costs. Variable costs. The total variable cost changes in direct proportion to changes in volume. Variable cost per unit remains constant. That's why we always look at variable costs on a per unit basis as it relates to production. Fixed costs. Total fixed costs remain constant within the relevant range. An example, if a factory can produce a maximum of 1,000 units, then the relevant range is 0 to 1,000 units because the cost will not change within that range. Fixed costs per unit change inversely within the relevant range, so we don't look at fixed costs on a per unit basis when we're doing cost analysis. So let's take a look at a graph to give you a better idea of variable costs. So here's an example. As the volume changes, so do the costs in total. Now let's look at fixed costs. So total fixed costs stay constant over a wide range. Fixed costs per unit of activity vary inversely in proportion to changes in volume. Fixed cost per unit of activity increases when volume decreases. Fixed cost per unit of activity decreases when volume increases. Total fixed cost graphs are always flat lines with no slope that intersect the y-axis at a level equal to total fixed costs. Total fixed costs can be expressed as y equals f. Y equals total fixed cost, F equals fixed cost over a given period of time. So let's take a look at a graph. So this is what it would look like for fixed costs, a straight line. A good example might be your rent. So now let's work an example. So to produce 120,000 units, they had total fixed costs of 300,000 and total costs, which included the variable costs, of 450. First, we're going to calculate the variable cost per unit, and then we're going to look at what it looks like at different production levels. And then we're going to look at variable and fixed costs on a per unit basis, because this gives you a better idea of cost behavior and what would happen if you use the average total cost for 280,000 units to predict total costs of 75,000 units. So first, let's start with the variable cost per unit. First, we're going to take our total cost minus our fixed costs, because we know those don't change. And that tells us our total variable costs. We divide by units because we know that the variable cost per unit is constant. Now it's $1.25. What is the total cost based on production? So we're looking at these various levels of production. So we're going to take each one of the units at the top times $1.25, and that tells us our total variable costs. We add our fixed costs, and that tells us our total cost. Now let's take a look at total cost per unit, cost based on production. Now, if you notice, total variable costs go up as production goes up in total, but fixed costs remain the same. But let's take a look at it on a per unit basis. Variable cost per unit does not change. However, fixed costs, the higher production, the average cost goes down. Again, that's why we don't look at it, because costs are not really changing. When you have fixed and variable costs together on a per unit basis, that's how you get a mixed cost. So those are our mixed costs. Now, what if we use the average cost for 280 units to price 75,000 units? Total cost would be 174, which, as we know, is far less than what it should be, which means it would be undercosting if we use that approach. Now, let's use our cost equations to express and predict costs. Mixed cost contain both variable and fixed components, increase with volume, does not start at the origin because you've got that fixed cost and then it changes based on variable costs. And so here's what that graph would look like. Cost behavior. There are 4 methods. We're only going to go over one of them because that's all you have to do in your homework. And that's high-low analysis, which I think is pretty easy. And regression, and we're not going to do that because you can just do that on the computer. All right, here is our formula. Y equals total mixed cost, V equals variable cost per unit, X equals number of units, and F equals fixed costs. So total mixed costs increase when volume increases, but not in direct proportion. Now let's take a look at high-low analysis. Step 1, we find the variable cost per unit of the cost line. It's the change in cost divided by the change in volume equals variable cost per unit. Next, we find the fixed costs, and we can do that based on figuring out the variable cost per unit. We create the cost equation, and then total cost equals fixed cost plus variable cost per unit times volume. We can do that as volume changes. And this is pretty easy to do. The disadvantage is you're only going to look at 2 points of data with the focus on units. Remember, it's always the highest and lowest activity, not dollars, although they tend to go hand in hand. So let's take a look at an example. All right, here's our example. We're thinking of going paperless. It would cost, the system would cost $81,800 per quarter, and it would cover up to 1,000 bills per quarter. Now, here is the cost data from the previous year. We're going to use high-low analysis to determine variable cost per unit and fixed cost. Now, if you look at this, the first thing you want to do is say, okay, here's the lowest and here's the highest. So those are the 2 data points we're going to be looking at. Then we're going to assume the company projects 740 bills to mail in the next quarter, and they are hoping that 20% will be paperless. Does that make the decision a good one? What happens if it's only 10%? So let's do our high-low analysis first, and then we can look at the effect of the volume. So first, we're going to find the highest activity and lowest, which we did. And we're going to subtract the difference in the cost and divide by the difference in the activity. So in this case, we ended up with 70 cents is our variable cost per unit. Now we're going to figure out our fixed costs. Now I like to do both. I do the highest and the lowest because you should always get the same number. Now in this example, we know now what our variable cost per unit is 70 cents, and we also know that our fixed costs are 260,000. So now we can look at what the effects are if we go to paperless and 20 or 10% of our users turn that way. Is it worth spending the $81,000? So the cost equation, and we have, is now 260 plus 70 cents times units. So first, we're going to look at the 20% change. And remember, you only look at the change. What's going to change? Well, the change is we're going to have to now spend 81,000, but we're going to reduce bills by 103,600, which means we'd have a cost savings of 21,800. What if it's only a 10%? Then in that case, it is not to our benefit if we can only convert 10%. Now that assumes that's a final number. I would think that you'd have to look at this over a number of months to decide whether how many people would want to go paperless. But based on just this data, we need to get at least 20% to make this worthwhile. Now let's take another look at a high-low. In this example, we have our costs, machine hours, and costs over the last 6 months. And we're going to look at variable cost, fixed cost, and then if 1,200 machine hours are used, what's going to be the total cost? So again, first we got to find the high and the low. So there's our high, and there's our low. And remember, it's units. Now we're going to do our analysis. And that tells us that our variable cost is going to be $1.60 per machine hour. Now we're going to find the vertical. Fixed costs equal total mixed cost minus total variable costs. So our high says fixed costs are $1,740. And our low says it's $1,740. And we know those two numbers are the same, so we know we're okay. Now we can do our cost equation. And there is our cost equation. And now we can look at 1,200 units. And the total cost would be $3,660. Cost decisions. Remember, we also have what we call committed fixed costs. These costs cannot be changed in the short term. Again, as if you had a 2-year lease. Discretionary fixed costs, more control over discretionary fixed costs because the companies can adjust. Good example is how much you spend on advertising expense. Now let's look at a couple more graphs. This is what's called a step. And I'll give you an example of this is if we are in a building, 1,000 square foot building, and we change production and now we need another building, that would be a step in cost because what ends up happening is our fixed costs would go up. And this is a curvilinear cost. It's not linear, doesn't fit any neat pattern. And that concludes part 1.